In the 100 years since pictures first moved across celluloid, one type of film has been watched by more people in more countries than any other. One subject matter has outraged and entertained in equal measure for over a century. So what is it? Horror? Comedy? Romance? Well, actually none of these. The biggest and most controversial films in the history of Hollywood have been based on stories from just one book, the best-selling book of all time. My name's Robert Beckford, and I've come to Hollywood to find out more of the incredible story of filming the Bible.
It's the greatest story ever told. I mean, it is the story that has resonance over 2,000 years. It's an extraordinary story.
The Bible's got 10 million stories in there. Every one of them's a winner.
The Bible is written for all of us. You know, it would be nice if we could interpret it artistically.
It's filthy, indecent. Any film that deals with religion, you have a problem. It's the combination of cinema and religion has always been incendiary.
It's difficult to film someone's psyche, but how do you film God?
For the first 1900 years since the birth of Christianity, the Church has dictated the way the Bible should be interpreted by all Christians all around the world. But within the last 100 years, a powerful rival has emerged to challenge the Church's version of things by bringing the Bible to life for the very first time. That rival is the entertainment industry. Religious films have always fueled passionate debate.
Always look on the bright side of life.
So disgusting when you think of it.
A lot of people go away very happy, laughing at that, their faith not touched one jot.
I don't think it really do.
Even the horror of the devil incarnate in a little girl had a profound effect on people's spirituality.
People who actually were not of a particularly religious bent, by their hundreds, ran screaming out of the theatres and into churches.
One more time, oh Lord!
But it's never been easy bringing history's most influential story to life.
I remember the studio wanted to give me bodyguards at the very beginning because there were lots of, threats.
One recent film encapsulates all of these arguments. A film that has ignited the passion in people more than any other movie in history, whether in condemnation or devotion to its fundamental message. The film was announced from the most unlikely of sources. Mel Gibson was one of Hollywood's hottest leading men, who had carved a name for himself playing psychologically unhinged action heroes.
They think I'm insane. And maybe I am.
Maybe you're a genius.
Hey, maybe I'm a genius.
When anybody heard that original announcement that Mel Gibson was going to do, a passion play on screen in Aramaic, everyone thought the same thing, which was, yeah, right, okay, you've gone nuts. And he was going to finance it outside of the studios because no one wanted to touch it. Because, hey, Mel, it's a passion play in Aramaic, and I'll see you when you're doing Lethal Weapon 5, and that'll be fine. So nobody had any sense that this was going to be even releasable.
Gibson's subject matter was nothing new. Using 21st century technology, he simply wanted to make a realistic version of the traditional passion plays that had been around for thousands of years. The script was even written in Aramaic and Latin to give it authenticity.
Haranash Binashak.
The film was finally released in Easter 2004 to global media attention, shooting straight to the top of the film charts around the world. It quickly caused more controversy and outrage than any other Bible film in history.
It was more like a boxing match. Garden of Gethsemane is a 12-round match tomorrow. You're going to be with me. You're going to be with me, Father. Okay, here we go. And then we go, and I kept calling it, it's called Punching Jesus.
There are 126 minutes to the film, and 100 of those are seeped in gore, which I found unwatchable, really.
His basic aesthetic is more is better. So if it's good to have Jesus scourged 100 times, it's better to have him scourged 200 times. And if it's good to have him scourged 200 times, it's better to have him scourged 300 times. So the scourging scene, which is the most violent part of the film, it's quite deliberate on Gibson's part. He knows what he's doing. He's trying to say to people, this is what the Savior of the world has done for you.
The violence wasn't the only reason that the film outraged cinema goers. It also reopened a bitter age-old dispute.
Our concern with the Passion of the Christ goes back almost 2,000 years. For almost 2,000 years, anti-Semitism in Western civilization had been legitimized, had been described and rationalized on 4 words: the Jews killed Jesus.
Anti-Semitism throughout the ages has been largely based on one line from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 27, in which the Pharisees say, "His blood be on us and on our children." Jews have been persecuted as Christ killers for years because of it, and many felt Gibson's film reinforced this myth.
Someone says to me this is an anti-Semitic movie. If you mean Gibson is blaming all Jewish people for the death of Christ, that is false, and that is not in the movie. If you mean Gibson is blaming the Jews at that time for the death of Christ, that is not in the movie. If you mean Gibson has gone overboard in depicting the villains in the movie as Jewish, I think you probably have a pretty good argument there.
The fact that Gibson was a strict traditionalist Catholic whose father had voiced strong anti-Semitic views in the press mobilized the Jewish community to come out and campaign against the film in their thousands.
This is a film, I say this as a rabbi, that has virtually no positive theological message. Its message is only that Jews were responsible for the murder of Jesus.
I think he's been quite explicit in making this movie against Jewish people.
The making of this film, in a paradoxical sense, was the attacks on it. I think that if, the Anti-Defamation League and the kind of organized Jewish resistance to the film had not existed, the film would be much smaller.
It was like the religious debate as the World Wrestling Federation slapped down, because you had the Jewish element accusing the movie of being anti-Semitic before they'd seen it or with leaked copies of the script and so on, which actually Mel Gibson turned around ultimately to his advantage. He made his film even more of an underdog, which meant those sort of Catholic viewers felt it was almost their sort of devout duty to go and see this film to support it.
Gibson harnessed the controversy caused by his movie as it quickly became one of the highest grossing films of all time, taking over $600 million at the box office. But outrage at religious films is nothing new. The Passion simply reignited an age-old theological argument for a new generation of filmgoers. Has the relationship between the entertainment industry and religious groups always been so fractious? Well, from the very birth of cinema, restrictions were put in place to ensure that Hollywood played by the books when depicting the Bible. But filmmakers have chosen to interpret these rules in a variety of ways. So how did Hollywood learn to shoot the Bible? And more importantly, how did America learn to worship film? The Bible is all about storytelling. This theatre was built in Hollywood almost 100 years ago, specifically to tell the stories of the Bible to people in the form of passion plays. But in Paris, in the winter of 1895, when the Lumiere brothers projected a series of moving images to a paying audience for the very first time, cinema was born. And it was one of the most dynamic and influential moments in cultural history. It's not hard to imagine the sense of excitement and wonder of those early audiences waiting for the first films to start. 110 years later, many people still feel a sense of awe and expectation every time they go to see a film. But watching films back then was really moving. It was like a religious experience. So it shouldn't be of any surprise that when it came to choosing subject matter, the pioneering filmmakers turned to the Bible.
The relationship between church and cinema is tortured and strange and strained. On the one hand, there is a deep suspicion of the cinema. On the other hand, from the earliest days, Hollywood has been interested in biblical stories.
The film industry is entertainment, primarily, right? I mean, and so, well, you know, pageantry in church, too, is entertainment to a certain extent.
The early film industry was intricately related to the church. First, Edison tried to give the patents for the motion picture camera to his local church. They refused it. The first radio station was at a church. The senior pastor kicked it out. But the church was a natural auditorium, and the church had a compulsion to communicate the gospel. In fact, in Paris, the Cathedral St. Notre Dame was used as the first cinema. And the cardinal, when he saw it, was shocked that they were showing the Passion there, so he kicked it out. So the story of the first few years of the movie industry is intricately involved in the church.
Despite being shunned by the church, the fledgling film industry was determined to tell the stories from the Bible. In fact, 7 of the first 10 one-reel films ever made had the word passion in the title.
Everybody knew all the stories of the Bible. That's what people were raised on. That's, you know, they knew more about the Bible than they probably did about, you know, half the films that were made. This was the basis of our civilization.
The first ever feature-length film of the life of Christ was made in 1912. From the Manger to the Cross was also the first film to be shot entirely on location outside Hollywood, with producers filming in both Palestine and Egypt. From the Manger to the Cross was a huge financial success as the public gave their blessing to this new way of telling Bible stories. For many Christians, it was a new and innovative way of spreading the gospel message. One of the early film distributors, Colonel Henry Hadley, had this to say: "These moving pictures are going to be a great force. They will be the best teachers and the best preachers in the history of the world." Now, Hadley may have been right, but it wasn't long before the church and cinema experienced their first major conflict of interest. D.W. Griffith was one of the grandfathers of modern film. It had huge box office success with his first feature, The Birth of a Nation, which courted controversy by portraying the Ku Klux Klan as avenging heroes in post-Civil War America. His next film was equally contentious. Intolerance told 4 intertwined stories of bigotry through the ages. One focused on the life of Christ, which, just like Mel Gibson's film 88 Years Later, immediately enraged powerful Jewish groups.
Again, the issue there was the depiction of Jews on the screen. And again, you have a population that's not literate but goes to movies. This is the vehicle of communication. And some of the scenes of depicting Jews were in the classical, stereotypic, middle-age caricatures.
They made various suggestions for changes that they wanted, and that included the insertion of extra cards pointing out that not all the Jewish leaders were hypocrites and only some of the Pharisees were hypocrites, and also cutting some scenes, the scenes particularly that showed Jewish responsibility for Jesus' death.
The Jewish faith weren't the only ones outraged by the way this new, unholy medium portrayed the story of Christ. This was only 3 years before Prohibition in America, and the Christian church demanded Griffith insert a note into the scene of the wedding at Cana explaining why Jesus was surrounded by alcohol. Unlike Mel Gibson, Griffith felt pressured by religious groups into making the cuts asked of him, which contributed to the film's failure at the box office. The church had fired its first warning shots across the bows of the evolving film business. The embryonic Hollywood film industry was fully aware that upsetting the church could have profound implications on the future of its business, so the likes of D.W. Griffith ensured that they trod very carefully. But it was here, in this old barn, that Hollywood finally began to assert itself. In 1913, a young film director called Cecil B. DeMille rented this old horse shed with two of his friends, Sam Goldwyn and Jesse Lasky. They used it to film the first ever feature-length movie made in Hollywood. The famous Players Lasky Company went on to become Paramount Studios, and DeMille, one of the most influential directors in the history of Hollywood. His name became a byword for biblical blockbusters, and through that, the very embodiment of the struggle between religion and film. DeMille is one of Hollywood's greatest directors. His uncompromising style and populist subject matter meant that his name on the credits became as much of a draw as the stars of the films themselves.
Cecil B. DeMille was a showman like cinema has not seen since. He just put on the most incredible spectacles. He would throw money at the screen and you would see everything up there.
He was a very imperial director on the set, demanded absolute control and absolute obedience.
His early film career was remarkable, as much for its variety as for the advancements he made in the technology of filmmaking. In his first 10 years as a director, he made over 50 movies. But it was with the incredible success of his first biblical film, The Ten Commandments in 1923, that he first realized the power of introducing new technology to the stories of the Bible.
Saw Ten Commandments when I was a kid, but I was blown away by it, but I think I was blown away most by the special effects. It was the spectacle, and that was always the situation with DeMille. Again, he knew there was a Christian audience.
In 1927, DeMille took a gamble that would influence not only the rest of his career, but the very future of Bible films. He decided to apply his knowledge of film technology and showmanship to retell the most sacred story of all, the life of Christ. The church was watching.
They had to be very careful there, and there's a wonderful moment where the first time you see Jesus on screen, played by H.B. Warner, is through the eyes of the blind man who's been cured. That's kind of interesting. But the Jesus is very pious.
With the early religious films, I tend to think they were more pious. It was also perhaps a limited theology, one might say, that it didn't give enough emphasis actually to what we believe as incarnation, that Jesus was actually here as a human being on earth. In a sense, Jesus is a moving icon.
DeMille was acutely aware of the trouble that Griffith had got into when dealing with the story of Christ, and treated his version with incredible reverence. He held prayer services on set every morning and demanded that none of his leading actors get involved in any unholy activities, such as frequenting nightclubs or even swimming.
It is the most beautiful portrayal of the gospel. And when you get to the end, I think the last scene where Thomas puts his finger and says, "My Lord and my God," I always weep at that point. It's just incredibly well done.
On its release, the film quickly became one of the most popular movies ever made, selling out to audiences across America.
DeMille himself, in his autobiography, 1959, claimed that his film had introduced more people to Jesus Christ than any other source except the Bible. And he used the number 800 million people.
Because it was silent, you would just slip the cards in different languages, and you could show it all around the world. And that's in fact what churches did. They showed it all around the world. So it was very important to the missionary effort.
The fact that this reinterpretation of the Gospels cast a spell on audiences all across the world forced the church to finally recognize the awesome power of cinema. They immediately began to scrutinize what they considered to be an amoral industry. In a period known as the Roaring Twenties, it wouldn't be a film that would finally bring down the full wrath of the church, but Hollywood itself.
Hollywood was, the two things were happening. Number one, that scandals started to arise in Hollywood. There was the Fatty Arbuckle scandal where a young woman died. There was the death of Wallace Reed, a big matinee idol with a drug overdose. And it was starting to give Hollywood kind of a bad name. And the people who were objecting to this bad name were religious people. And they were literally, people would give sermons on the weekend saying, "Don't go to this film. This is an evil film."
Hollywood was terrified that intervention by the church would lead to censorship. In an attempt to pacify them, they hired a former postmaster general called Will Hayes to act as head of their self-regulatory board. The regulation Hayes introduced in 1930 became known as the Production Code.
The code sets up high standards of performance for motion picture producers. It states the considerations which good taste and community value make necessary in this universal form of entertainment: respect for law, respect for every religion, respect for every race, and respect for every nation.
The Hayes Code was introduced in the 1930s, and it was sort of the first form of censorship for cinema.
With the Production Code, the church hoped to rein in all of cinema's amoral excesses.
There is no room on the screen at any time for pictures which offend against common decency.
DeMille, however, was never one to be told what he could and couldn't do, and decided to test the church and its new rules. He embarked upon the first ever biblical talkie about the very basis of Christianity.
I think DeMille, as a very upfront Christian, having presented the story of Jesus, then got interested in the early history of the church, and it lends itself, of course, to spectacle with all the martyrdom scenes. And I think still you can get away with all kinds of things in costume that you can't get away with in contemporary dress.
The Sign of the Cross in 1932 told the story of the persecution of early Christians under the Roman Emperor Nero.
The film is filled with lurid images. There's nude Christians being thrown to the lions. There's a lesbian dance with Joyce Joyner trying to entice Elissa Landi.
Draw me, gently touch my heart.
Will Hayes saw the film and demanded that the lesbian dance be cut out, and DeMille stood his ground. He absolutely refused to cut it, and the film was released as is. He won the battle at that time.
DeMille may have won the battle, but the Hays Code had been in its infancy. As it grew rapidly in strength and power, movies were quickly censored. When The Sign of the Cross was re-released a few years later, all the contentious scenes were cut out. The Hays Code proved that the church was still a potent force to be reckoned with. But soon, Hollywood would have a far greater threat to worry about. In the early 1950s, cinema faced a new adversary, a rival that threatened the very future of Hollywood more than the church ever had. That rival was television, with its potential for making movies obsolete by beaming directly into people's living rooms. Hollywood would have to act, and act fast. If television could entertain people for free, cinema would have to give them something special. Once again, Hollywood turned to the Bible for answers.
The Robe, brought to you through the miracle of CinemaScope, in all its power and drama, in all its scope and magnificence. You see more because there is more on the film to see.
Well, I think one of the reasons biblical epics got more popular in the 50s is that it was the arrival of widescreen and the arrival of color. And these stories were really well suited to that. When people looked for something, they said, we got this widescreen, what are we going to put on it? Well, we'll put lions and we'll put, fights, and well, it's the Bible. We'll put the Bible on the widescreen.
The present restricted screen in an empty theatre looks like this. CinemaScope enlarges the width so as to give a panoramic view such as the human eye normally enjoys.
I wasn't aware as a young kid that these were particularly, biblical stories, but they were thrilling. They were, this was great stuff. There were, armies and gorgeous women and power. It was a great, great story, and you got your money's worth.
If big biblical epics were back in fashion, Cecil B. DeMille was the only man qualified to lead Hollywood out of the wilderness. The end of World War II had seen the emergence of a new threat to the freedom of the Western world, Communist Russia. Not only was Cecil B. DeMille adept at the biblical epic, but he was also an expert in capturing the mood of the American public. He decided to remake his 1923 film The Ten Commandments as a rally cry for all Americans in the struggle against the Red aggressor.
DeMille takes the story of the Ten Commandments and basically turns it into a version of the Cold War story that's unfolding in his time. So we see him early on talk about Ramses as being a dictator and this being about the birth of freedom and the end of slavery.
Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, this may seem an unusual procedure, speaking to you before the picture begins. But we have an unusual subject. The theme of this picture is whether men are to be ruled by God's law or whether they are to be ruled by the whims of a dictator like Ramesses. Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God?
If America needed someone to single-handedly stand up and represent them in the fight for liberty and equality against a ruthless dictator, there was only one man who could fill the role.
Charlton Heston, in other roles could appear rigid, could appear square, but here as Moses, he had to be a figure of unassailable rectitude. He had to be kind of like Mr. Right, capital M, capital R.
For this you shall drink bitter waters. God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
DeMille was nothing if not patriotic, and if the Ten Commandments was going to represent America's supremacy over Russia, then he'd make sure it was bigger and better than any film in history. Shot entirely on location in Egypt for $13.5 million, this was at the time the most expensive film ever made, and a biblical epic like no other. The Exodus scene alone took 2 weeks to film and involved over 3,000 extras and 1,500 crew.
Seemingly everywhere at once was Cecil B. DeMille. Check even the most minute details through high-powered binoculars, giving instructions in the midst of the huge and often unwieldy crowd. Charlton Heston here seen surveying the preparations before donning his makeup for the impressive sequence of the patriarch Moses leading his people on the Exodus.
When you really realize that there were literally all these thousands of people there, and it took a huge amount of planning. There were assistant directors on top of assistant directors and guys on platforms with megaphones. It was an enormous thing.
The scale of the Exodus was matched by the scale of the special effects when DeMille created one of the most memorable scenes in the history of film.
Cecil B. DeMille, it's been said, is the only is parted the Red Sea twice, once more than God.
Parting of the Red Sea scene is still amazing. When you watch it now, you still look at it and think, how did they do that? And this is a special effect that was 50 years ago, and it still looks amazing.
Behold his mighty hand!
The Ten Commandments opened to worldwide success, taking over $80 million at the box office. In today's prices, The Passion of the Christ is the only religious film to have made more. It reignited Hollywood's love affair with Bible films, but it was to be DeMille's last. The man who had single-handedly invented the biblical epic and taught Hollywood how to film the Bible died 2 years after its release.
I think for DeMille to end his career on the Ten Commandments was wonderfully appropriate. I mean, it was a biblical film, that would have been his bread and butter. He's going to God with the Ten Commandments at the top of his credit list and saying, look what I've done, I've been doing good work for you. And it was a huge success. He would be delighted to go out on a huge success.
The informal truce between Hollywood and the church had been forged through the threat of the Cold War of the 1950s. But soon, traditional ways of interpreting the Bible would become stale. The revolutionary 1960s demanded a more radical cultural shake-up. But could the Bible film survive this transformation? Filming the Bible has been a continuing theme in the evolution of the movie industry. In America, the Cold War generation was fed a diet of big-budget biblical epics based on rousing stories of freedom and salvation from oppression in the Old Testament. In the early 1960s, one legendary film director would apply the same principles to the New Testament. George Stevens was responsible for the huge success of films such as Giant and Shane, and had his own personal reasons for believing that the story of Jesus needed retelling for the post-war generation.
The story of Jesus had always been had a subtext of anti-Semitism, and that the Jews were Christ killers. And none of that was based on, a scholarly interpretation of the Old Testament or the New Testament. And he referred to taking the mischief out of the story of Jesus by kind of removing that element of anti-Semitism.
During the Second World War, Stevens had headed the US Army Film Division and had personally filmed the liberation of the last concentration camp at Dachau.
As he said during those years, he saw men at their best and at their worst. And that certainly affected him, and as it would anyone.
In 1961, Stevens embarked on what was to be the biggest production of his prolific career. The Greatest Story Ever Told was an unprejudiced 3-hour epic charting the life of Christ from birth to resurrection.
When you set out to tell the story of Christ, an immediate question comes up: who's going to portray Jesus?
Having previously worked with Hollywood legends like James Dean, Stevens shocked everyone by casting unknown Swedish actor Max von Sydow.
Baptize me, John. What is your name? Jesus. Where born? Bethlehem.
If I was Jesus.
Casting Jesus is always tricky because it's you know, the iconic role, and you know that no matter who gets the role, they're going to be criticized for it.
I think whether we like a film or we don't like a film is often determined by our preconceived notion of what Jesus should look like.
Why does he walk into a room and glow? Why can't he walk into a room and look like the fellow who was sitting next to you the other day on the bus?
What Jesus looked like is a centuries-old subject of debate, as every age has imprinted their own image upon him. The Byzantines gave him a beard as a symbol of power, whilst the Victorians made him blonde. But although he's been played over 50 times in mainstream cinema, there's been one startling omission. He's never been played by a Jewish actor.
I look forward to the day when there will be a more authentic, Semitic-looking and sounding Jesus in that kind of context. I don't know what the impact will be, but it would be a tonic to what people complain then as the middle-class British-sounding Jesus.
I would just like to see one that was really, really authentic and kind of dirty and grubby and, you know, really looked like the time and place.
If I was Jesus.
Von Sydow's Anglo-Saxon Jesus and the magnificent scale of Stevens' production both hark back to the bygone era of 50s epics. But this was the 1960s, and cultural events had overtaken the film's grandiose approach to the Bible.
My father told of getting on the plane to fly to New York to show the picture to the Bob Benjamin and Arthur Krim, the people who ran United Artists and who were tremendous supporters of the film. And he got on American Airlines, and it was in the days when the stewardess would come and offer you a magazine. And he said, "Would you have Time magazine?" And she said, "Well, yeah, right here." She handed him Time magazine, and he looked at the cover, and the cover of Time magazine had this headline, "Is God Dead?"
Time magazine's iconic cover encapsulated a drastic change in people's attitudes towards religion. Churches lay empty as a revolutionary spirit swept through the Western world. By 1964, combat troops had been sent to Vietnam, and the civil rights movement was at its peak. People didn't want slow, pious Jesus movies. Cinema needed to discover a new way of filming the Bible in a language society understood. Every portrayal of Jesus has reflected the times in which it was produced. But this has never been more true than in the radical and revolutionary 1960s. Bob Dylan sang, "Times they are a-changing." And it wasn't just the world of music and politics that were being shaken up. The Bible would also be completely reinvented for the flower-powered generation. While American cinema struggled to make its biblical films relevant, in Europe filmmaking was being explored as both an art form and a means of political agitation.
I planned it in my mind to make a feature on one of the Gospels, let's say, only set it in New York and have everybody modern dress at the time in black and white, and a kind of faux cinema verite style. And then, of course, I saw Gospel according to Matthew.
It was almost the dream biblical movie. I mean, I think really if you wanted to make an ideal, I think it's the best movie about the life of Jesus that's ever been made by a wide margin.
In Italy, one artist that was experimenting with film embodied the revolutionary spirit of the 60s, but as a religious filmmaker, he seemed severely flawed.
He's a Marxist, he's a poet, he's gay,
He is somebody who has clashed with the authorities in the past and will clash with the authorities again. So of all the people that you could get to do a respectable adaptation of the Gospel of Matthew, he is the last person you would think of.
Here is an atheist who has made the greatest film about Jesus ever. Now, how does that happen? I do not know.
Pier Paolo Pasolini was a radical poet and filmmaker in the 1960s whose previous work had focused on championing the rights of the underclasses of Italian society. One film even got him imprisoned for blasphemy.
Pasolini believed that Matthew's Gospel best represented Jesus's understanding of and approach to the poor of his time. And Pasolini, being a Marxist, was most interested in kind of Jesus as social revolutionary.
The film was absolutely faithful to the Bible. In fact, every word in the movie is taken directly from Matthew's Gospel. But what's intriguing is that when spoken in the context of the radical revolutionary 1960s, it shows a completely new side of Jesus' character.
Sta scritto, la mia casa sarà casa di orazione, ma voi ne fate una spelonca di ladri.
It's a Jesus who really believed that his mission was to help the poor and to be an activist force, not to be passive. And that is very much a product of the 60s, when this kind of social activism was very much on people's minds.
To maintain the spirit of social revolution, Pasolini cast a student who came to his door trying to raise funds for the Communist Party in the lead role of his film.
My initial reaction to Pier Paolo was a blatant, clear, no, I'm not interested. He finally convinced me. He finally convinced me, yes, by making me see what he wanted me to see, that this movie was a part of my fight, and this movie was part of the revolution.
It is a film in which every single face is a face of a real person, you know, somebody you can really genuinely believe in, who you don't think had just been in a soap commercial.
Yeah, nobody was an actor. We were all picked in the streets or in the houses, not being actors at all, and working with them was the most natural thing on earth.
Everything about it visually is very kind of lean and very unadorned and very unspectacular-like. It's almost an attempt to tell this very miraculous story in a very non-miraculous way to make it seem more miraculous.
Pasolini went on to make numerous experimental and controversial films, but was murdered in suspicious circumstances in 1975.
I think that as art, Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew will remain as one of the most famous representations of Christ, reflecting the times, and also, again, the ideology of the man.
He was an extraordinary man, a beautiful person.
Pasolini's Christ was a far cry from the outdated opulence of the greatest story ever told. It seemed to look forward to the spirit of the 1960s and all it stood for by radically stripping back the story of Christ to its most basic roots. By 1969, Jesus as social revolutionary would even seep into British living rooms via that bastion of tradition, the BBC, when one of this country's most controversial screenwriters adapted the story for the small screen. Dennis Potter is renowned for his infamous TV plays such as Brimstone and Treacle, which was banned by the BBC for 11 years. At the end of the 1960s, he even tried his hand at the story of Christ.
Mrs. Whitehouse wanted me prosecuted for blasphemy after Son of Man, about Jesus. And there are millions of Jesuses, obviously. And mine was just one of them. But there was a row in the Australian Parliament about it.
When Son of Man was shown on television in 1969, there was an extraordinary reaction. Some people hated it, some people thought it was marvellous. The people who thought it was marvellous, I think, were in the Pasolini tradition. So he was another kind of revolutionary or questioning Jesus, and that was a very good challenge at the end of the 60s. For those who didn't like it, they felt it was far too human. They could not come to terms with Dennis Potter's dialogue.
My name is Jesus.
and I come from God.
Now go on, get off, go on, leave us alone. You loony, you nutcase. You ought to be locked up, running about with blood in your flaming face.
There was a kind of need in the 60s to want to somehow put things right, or at least now to open the books somewhat and be much more natural.
I understand your anger. I understand your fear.
I'm not frightened.
Well, I am. Oh, bloody well am I.
Yes, son, he's a loony. He's a loony.
One felt that one wanted to find, in the nicest possible refined sense, bollocks and some strength in the whole Jesus story. So we all were enthusiastic to kind of bring something new to it.
But Dennis Potter chose to develop a controversial new aspect of Jesus' character.
At the agony in the garden, Potter put into Jesus' mouth a question which he repeated, "Is it me? Is it me?" And those who said, well, Jesus was divine, therefore he knew that he had to die, said this is blasphemous.
Is it me? Is it me?
The public reaction to it all was quite appalling. I mean, people were shocked and grieved by it and offended by it. And newspapers were offended. There's nothing violent and horrible and ugly about it. It is somehow a tapestry. It is a scene. It is a play.
I think it was a very interesting culmination of the 60s in questions from Jesus films.
The social revolution of the 1960s faded out in a haze of marijuana smoke as a new decade introduced a new philosophy. The 1970s were a particularly funky period. In fashion, flares got wider and wider. And in music, glam rock stomped its platform-shoed way to the top of the charts. Rock operas like Tommy and Hair were big hits on Broadway and in the West End. Soon Jesus would also receive a 1970s makeover, becoming an all-singing, all-dancing, chart-topping superstar. Filmmakers were always looking for new ways of telling the story of Christ. In 1973, the first singing Jesus was in the uninspiring film Godspell. But setting the Gospels to music would be immortalized that same year by two young English musicians at the start of their prolific careers. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice had wanted to make a musical of the story of Jesus, told from Judas's point of view, for years, but couldn't get any backing for such a radical retelling of the Gospels. They managed to record just one single, I Don't Know How to Love Him, with Yvonne Elliman.
If he said he loved me.
The song raced to the top of the charts, and a full musical was immediately commissioned. Once the stage show had been made, it wasn't long before Hollywood saw a way of tapping back into the vibe of religious movies.
For many of us, the mid-70s, Jesus came alive very much through Jesus Christ Superstar.
I thought it was anti-establishment. I thought it was very youth-orientated. That's why I set the film with a group of young rock performers, dancers and singers going to the desert, into the ruins of Avdat, to perform this happening.
Norman Jewison was the hit director of Oscar-winning film In the Heat of the Night. Yet for this production, he set off for the deserts of the Holy Land with nothing but a camera crew and a group of professional singers and dancers to film his iconic 1973 production.
It connected Jesus with the times. It connected him with social activism, with kind of this free-spirited hippie lifestyle, wandering this, the countryside and helping people and having this little band of kind of scruffy hippies, basically, that followed him around.
It was a rock opera. Actually, it was more like a disco opera, I thought. And it was so much of the 70s, with the hairstyles and everything. But you know what? I thought it was believable, and I thought it was moving. And I can see where it could have touched some people very deeply.
Can't you know I love you? Did you see our way? I believe in you and God, so tell me that I say.
The average temperature was like 105. You know, it was up in that area, and it was like grueling.
Christ, you know I love you. Did you see our way? I believe in you and God, so tell me that I'm saved.
Yeah, I think Superstar and the times that it was filmed in, you know, go hand in hand. The music has the 70s written all over it.
I think it's endured because of the exhilaration that people feel when they hear that theme. I think it's a very, very strong theme, you know, bum, bum, pum, 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 pum.
You've got Judas in that huge kind of black power, you know, Black Panther power outfit with the giant afro, kind of huge flares, and he's dancing around with the background singers, and the spotlights are, you know, swirling around, and it's just completely out of control.
Tell me what you think about your friends at the top. Now who'd you think besides yourself was the pick of the crop?
This biblical song and dance proved that Bible stories could be perfectly adapted through film to capture the mood of the times. But the free-spirited 1970s were about to mutate into something far more sinister. Could filmmakers once again reinterpret the Bible to provide spiritual nourishment for a generation of lost souls?
It was sickening.
I don't know, it was just really too much.
It was really scary.
Filming the Bible is big business. Here in Morocco, a multi-million-pound industry has emerged from filmmakers using this landscape as a biblical backdrop. That's Jesus' Jerusalem behind me. But Bible films and the church have had a rocky history over the last 110 years, as the church has attempted to rein in Hollywood's different interpretations of the Bible. Bible films have had the power to reawaken ancient religious conflicts.
I think he's been quite explicit in making this movie against Jewish people.
Inspire devotion through the power of moving images, and adapt dramatically to stay fresh and relevant to audiences. As the Vietnam War raged into its second decade and Nixon sat in the White House, the 1970s saw the world waking up to the fact that the summer of love was finally over. It had been 10 years since Time magazine had pronounced that God was dead, and it seemed like religion was obsolete to this disaffected generation. But in Hollywood, things are never quite what they seem. So it's fitting that this time, salvation came from the most unlikely of places. In 1973, the film world was taken by storm by an epic tale of the battle between good and evil. Although not strictly a Bible story, its spiritual message of redemption through sacrifice had a powerful effect on audiences who came out in their hundreds of thousands to see what hell had in store for them.
The devil went down to Georgia. He was looking for a soul to steal.
The theater owners tell us that an average of 3 men, but only 2 women, faint at every evening performance.
It was sickening.
Did it make you ill? I don't know, it was just really too much.
It was really scary. It was kind of gross too.
It is a parable of its time, and it says something about the state of the 1970s, that's what it took to grab people's attentions. You know, people weren't just going to settle for the hippy-dippy stuff anymore.
Students that have talked to me, I think it's had a good result. They say God and the devil has been in the back of their mind. Now they have to look at it. They pray more.
The film that caused this renewed interest in religion was The Exorcist, a movie of the book by William Peter Blatty, which tells the story of a 14-year-old girl who is possessed by the devil and the struggle of 2 Catholic priests to exorcise her demons.
Mother, please!
Dr. Taylor.
What is it? What's happening? Stop! It's burning! It's burning! Do something, Doctor. Please help her.
I mean, I think the controversial side of the film is that it was about the devil. It was looking at the dark side of spirituality, and also the fact that it had Linda Blair, a little girl, playing this completely evil, maniacal role.
All right, let's see what to do. Keep away! The sow is mine!
It took, you know, a sort of a forgotten religion and placed it right in a modern urban setting. And the result of it was that people who actually were not of a particularly religious bent, by their hundreds, ran screaming out of the theatres and into churches.
I've heard pastors talk about their conversion experience coming through watching a film like The Exorcist, being very, very scared and then seeking God.
It's perhaps telling of how influential and powerful cinema had become that in such a godless time, it was a film and not organised religion that persuaded people back into church. By the mid-1970s, Bible films had expanded in every direction, pushing the boundaries as far as they could. They cast Jesus as a disco dancer and the devil incarnate in a little girl. Things had gone too far. It was time to get back to basics. People come here to Morocco to film because of the realism its ancient locations adds to Bible films. And it was here in North Africa that the next production would come that would unite both church and entertainment industry for the first time in possibly the most reverent version of the Gospels ever made. But this time, salvation didn't come from the silver screen, but from its poor relation, television. In 1977, there was a religious phenomenon that gripped audiences around the world. It was the miniseries of all miniseries, and because it was beamed directly into people's living rooms, it was watched by more people than any other mainstream Hollywood movie.
Jesus of Nazareth was something that everybody ended up sitting down on a Sunday night to watch. And therefore, it became a talking point, a national talking point.
Like many of the most important works of religious art throughout the ages, Jesus of Nazareth was commissioned from the very top, when Lou Grade, the legendary television producer and head of ITV, met God's representative on earth.
I'd promised Pope Paul that I would make the life of Jesus. After he congratulated me on doing Moses, he said, I hope one day you will do the life of Jesus. And I said, I will.
And I just couldn't believe it. I thought, not possible. It's such a big, amazing thing. I just couldn't think he would go on with that. But then, of course, Lou always kept his promise. I was worried.
Grade hired legendary opera director Franco Zeffirelli to bring the project to life. He in turn thought of casting both Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino in the role of Jesus, before a young British actor caught his eye.
Because eyes, I always believe strongly, eyes are the main instrument of communication for an actor through the screen. You always look, when you go to the movies, you always look your actors or actresses in their eyes.
They are an actor's, well, they are the best tool you've got. You know, and particularly if you're short-sighted as well, which I am. So you have your focus for the camera is beyond what you're looking at, which makes it very, very powerful.
It is I who need baptism from you. And yet you come to me. Let it be so. We must fulfill all righteousness.
In a way, being asked to play a role like John the Baptist, where, people's expectations are very high, because this is an important character in an important religion. You sense a certain responsibility. But I don't think it's the same responsibility that Robert Powell had playing Jesus Christ.
As a responsibility of playing the part, I think we've touched on that. It was just to be to be the Christ that people imagined him to be.
How does an actor approach playing the most famous man in history?
For whatever reason, I didn't feel a lot of pressure to play the role because it was going to be what it was going to be. I wasn't going to be an interpreter, I was going to inhabit the role.
So many people have invested so much in Jesus. And that sort of is too much for you to take in.
I scoured the Gospels to find some clue as to who he was. There is nothing there at all. Nothing.
You have to have, I think, a strong presence. That's the important thing, and that the inner capacity of the actor to identify in some ways with Jesus is important. Robert Powell, I think, did it.
Everybody remembers Robert Powell's Jesus, and everybody loved Robert Powell in fact, Robert Powell is Jesus.
I had thousands, literally thousands, tens of thousands of letters from people saying that is exactly how I imagined my Christ to be.
It is accomplished.
The series aired across Europe on Easter Day 1977, and such was the devotion it inspired that it even received the approval of the Catholic Church when, in his Easter address, the Pope told the faithful to go home and watch Jesus of Nazareth.
It became an instrument of missionary penetration throughout the world.
It was the most extravagant and extraordinary televisual experience of its time.
As Jesus of Nazareth was watched by millions of people across the world, the Church realized the impact that a theologically, politically correct film could have in spreading the word of Christ. That television phenomenon may have been the most successful commercial version of the Gospels, but there's another film made just 2 years later that's been seen by more people in more countries than any other movie in the history of film. And you've probably never even heard of it.
It's the #1 most watched movie of all time. If you ask some people what they think is the most watched, they may give you Titanic, they may give you Gone with the Wind, or some other classic. But the #1 most watched movie of all time is the Jesus film.
The Jesus Film Project was a low-budget movie made in 1979 and was initially destined for a small cinema release in America.
I had a good track record. I'd done a lot of work. And I thought, you can't turn down this opportunity. So I said, okay, and then that was it. It all started to roll from there.
Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who bringeth forth bread from the earth.
What made the Jesus film unique is that it was not funded by a major Hollywood studio, but by an evangelical organization called Campus Crusade for Christ.
The Jesus Film Project began in 1979. It was part of the vision of Bill Bright, who was the founder and president of Campus Crusade for Christ International, to put the Bible into film. In fact, Luke's Gospel was the Gospel, the place that they chose to start. And so the Jesus Film Project is basically an accurate portrayal of the life of Jesus as seen through the eyes of Luke.
We literally filmed Luke as it's written, verbatim. And I kind of thought, well, we need a writer, because some of it's okay, but when you start saying, verily I say unto thee, you think, hang on a minute, these are not words to be spoken, these are words that were written.
Verily I say unto you, whosoever shall not receive the kingdom of God as a little child shall in no wise enter therein. Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you all is the greatest.
But I didn't know what the end product was supposed to be or what its usage would be. I was making the film thinking that this was a film that was to be released in America and maybe in England, and that was it. That was the end of it. I had no knowledge of the way the film was then going to be develop or grow and turn into the thing that it is today.
The film didn't register at the box office, but that wasn't the point. Campus Crusade took it on a global mission, showing it in hundreds of countries around the world, often to people who had never even seen a film before. The church was finally harnessing the technology it had spurned for almost a century to spread the word of Christ.
I was in Guatemala visiting some missionaries who would go into the backwoods, strap a generator onto the back of their motorcycle and a projector, and go back into Guatemalan Indians and show the Jesus film in the backwoods. That has been done in country after country after country, in language after language after language.
The film works very well for audiences who are not so much used to Western cinema storytelling styles. It's very direct. It's not so much causal, it's this happened, this happened, this happened.
In the third world, there are some people who've never seen a film, they've never even seen a light bulb. That's just a film. And the film is taken, on elephants or on boats and to the remotest parts. And often then, the reaction is spectacular.
Wherever there's more than 1 million people speaking a language, the film will be translated. And I think up to now, today, they're up to about 900 and something. And 5 billion people have seen it. I never knew any of that was going to happen, and I still find it extraordinary.
A revelation is a visual experience, and you can take the poorest person, most illiterate person, uneducated, untraveled person in the world and communicate profound truths to them in an instant with a visual illustration.
John Gilman knows more than most about the impact film can have, especially on those unfamiliar with it. In 1979, he had a lucrative career as a TV producer in the States, but there was a nagging doubt about what his true calling was.
And I prayed, and I earnestly prayed, and I heard these words very powerfully inside my heart, not audibly. I want you to do the same thing I did when I was on earth. I spoke to the people in parables and stories. You do the same thing. From that moment, I was convinced that dramatizing the Bible stories was approved by God. So with that, we sold our home and took the savings, little savings that we had, and I went to India to see how I could make a film with Indian actors on the life of Jesus. And I was astounded at what I found.
What he found was that a film of Jesus' life had just been made, but had been given an Indian makeover by Hindu filmmaker Vijay Chanda. As soon as Gilman saw the film, he realised he'd found his calling and teamed up with Chanda to help him exhibit the movie right across India.
We started one night. I had a tailor sew together 8 bed sheets and make a screen, and they put it up between bamboo poles, and they went around the village with a rickshaw and a little poster on the back announcing, "Come and see the story of the greatest prophet who ever lived. It's free in this field tonight." One of my favorite scenes in the movie is the healing of the leper. This is extraordinary because in India there are probably as many lepers as there are believers in Christ today. So people do understand this story.
Yeah.
They fall in love with Jesus at this point. It's my favorite scene. I watched them cry, weep over the death of Christ, cheer and applaud his resurrection. What a powerful tool, this cinema and this Diasaga movie.
Gilman claims over 19 million Indians have seen Der Sagar since 1979, with a staggering 7 million conversions to Christianity. Campus Crusade continues to show the Jesus film throughout the world and claims they've had a mind-boggling 200 million conversions to Christ. By the late 1970s, the church had finally discovered the incredible power of cinema as a missionary tool, spreading the word of God to the far-flung corners of the earth. Back in England, however, a group of comedians were about to reignite the age-old battle between liberal Hollywood and the conservative church. They came out here to North Africa, borrowed the sets from Jesus of Nazareth and began filming the life story of a very naughty boy.
Is it absurd? Was Jesus' coming on this earth absurd? And I think it gives us a chance to say, well, if you think it is, this is what it would look like.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away. Who are you? I'm his mother, that's who. Behold his mother! Behold his mother!
By the late 1970s, Monty Python were at the pinnacle of their careers. After 4 television series and 1 successful film, it seemed they could do no wrong. In 1978, they embarked on their second feature film, provisionally entitled Jesus Christ, Lust for Glory.
We knew we didn't want to satirize Jesus, because we thought Jesus, he's okay, he's a good guy, he said some wonderful things. And it's the people who begin to follow and then create more and more this world that is dominated by religion. And so we went to work on it.
I thought it was the best screenplay I'd ever read. It was just brilliant, and it was so funny and so clever, and I didn't find it offensive because it was hitting the right buttons, but in a comedic way, not in any sacrilegious way.
Hail, Messiah! I'm not the Messiah! I say you are, Lord, and I should know I followed a few. Hail, Messiah! I'm not the Messiah. Will you please listen? I am not the Messiah. Do you understand? Honestly!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right, I am the Messiah. He is! He is the Messiah!
Basically, it's about the followers. It's not a film about the Messiah. It's a film about all the people who say, you are the Messiah. And actually, the clever comic conceit at the centre of it is at the very beginning of the film, you see Brian being born, and then down the road, Jesus is born, and the wise men turn up to the wrong place, and then they realise they've gone to the wrong place, and then they go. So it establishes right at the beginning, as the film says, he's not the Messiah.
Leave it alone. Give it a rest.
Do you mind? I can't hear a word he's saying.
We made it very clear at the beginning of the film that there's Jesus up on the Mount giving the Sermon on the Mount, and there's a crowd of people here, and we go and talk to the people in the very back of that crowd.
Would you be quiet, please? What was that? I don't know. I was too busy talking to Big Nose. I think it was blessed are the cheesemakers.
What's so special about the cheesemakers?
Well, obviously, it's not meant to be taken literally. It refers to any manufacturers of dairy products.
They couldn't hear what was being said, and it's quite reasonable to misinterpret. But then, hasn't a lot of religion been about misinterpretation, that, you know, people mishear things, or they hear what they want to hear.
There was one scene in particular that ensured the Monty Python team were heading for trouble.
Cheer up, Brian. You know what they say? Some things in life are bad. They can really make you mad.
We arrived in the morning, and the crosses were already up there. It was very emotive. And you kind of thought, well, okay, this is pushing it a little bit.
Always look on the bright side of life.
Life of Brian, I thought the crucifixion scene at the end was blasphemous.
Why is that?
Well, you know, it was being played for laughs, and being, you know, they multiply the crucifixions and so on. You know, for Christians, this is a rather central, important act.
Always look on the bright side of life.
It may seem like harmless fun today, but on its release in 1979, the film caused incredible outrage.
In America, in the Bible Belt, it was banned and nobody saw it. Where in England, you know, individual cities would ban it.
Michael Palin and John Cleese even had to resort to going on television to defend the film against its fiercest critics, angry Christians.
I wasn't vicar of the university church for nothing. I'm familiar with undergraduate humour.
The Bishop of Southwark came in there with all his purple, the whole drag act, and with the biggest crucifix I've ever seen on his chest, great silver crucifix, which he was fingering the whole time to show, you know, his power and his sanctity.
You keep making the basic assumption that we are ridiculing Christ and Christ's teaching, and I say that we are not.
You have succeeded in reducing something which has inspired the greatest art into something which is presented in terms of the lowest art.
I think it probably turned more people off the church, that one performance, than the number the Life of Brian brought into the church.
The Life of Brian may have outraged religious groups, but it did broaden the public's acceptance of different ways of interpreting the Bible. What with whistling on the cross and the ridiculing of a religion, it seemed like Christians had seen it all. But they hadn't counted on a new film about to be made by one of the most influential directors in the history of film that would become the most controversial film ever made about the Bible. It seemed like Hollywood had pushed Christians one step too far, and this time they'd come out fighting. By the 1980s, the church and cinema had once again reached an informal truce in their complex relationship. Although religious groups acknowledged that Hollywood had a right to creatively interpret the Bible, filmmakers knew that there was only so far that they could go. But in 1988, one filmmaker was tempted by the artistic freedoms that cinema offered and came out here to Morocco to explore the life of Jesus in a way that had never been seen before. And as a result, scandalized both religious groups and Hollywood as well.
It is, even before it's opened, notorious. More than that, it's scurrilous, disgusting, obscene and blasphemous. Or anyway it is if you listen to those who've got their chastity belts in a twist over it.
Well, the bottom line is that religion, on one level, religion on the other hand, matters having to do with the spirit, let's say, the spiritual life, have been very important to me in all my life.
Well, when I first met Scorsese in the early 70s, he said there were two books he wanted to do, Gangs of New York and Last Temptation.
Nikos Kazantzakis' 1961 novel, The Last Temptation of Christ, discusses the idea of Jesus being tempted into believing he is not the Messiah and shunning his suffering on the cross to come down and live a normal life as a human being.
It's a fiction in which one can contemplate the true nature of Jesus and what we are as human beings and our relationship to God and about suffering. That's basically what it's about.
The Church had already expressed its condemnation of this book when the Vatican blacklisted it for humanizing Christ at the expense of his divinity. Scorsese knew he was playing with fire.
God loves me. I know he loves me. I want him to stop. I can't take the pain, the voices and the pain.
I think it was clear from the script and everything that Marty told me that this was a portrait to develop the human side of Jesus, to balance out the often portrayed divine side.
You know, the church has always played a little semantic game here. You know, the Council of Nicaea, Christ is fully human and fully divine. That said, let's sort of forget about the human. I mean, that's always been the game. We know he's fully human, we just don't want to talk about it. And so if you're going to actually believe that someone can be fully human and fully divine, you've got to make them have human desires.
What are you doing here? I want you to forgive me.
The idea was to make it something that was accessible, and also to understand the fear and the weakness of the human side of Jesus, the human nature. To understand, this is what Kazantzakis was getting at, I think, that the struggle between the spirit and the flesh.
Seldom do you have such a passive character that has such strong actions, because he's acted upon, given the nature of, you've got this force outside of him creating a dilemma.
I don't have to be sacrificed.
No. No, you don't.
I'm not the Messiah.
No. No, you're not.
But in terms of the last temptation, the thing that actually caused all the offence, Jesus is on the cross, and the last temptation is he is shown a life of being an ordinary man. He is shown the possibility of a life in which he is not the Son of God, in which he is a man who indeed marries.
What's that?
A wedding ceremony.
Who's getting married?
You are.
It was so unbelievably blasphemous that I sat in the film and nearly cried.
Jesus Christ created the world. He created Judas. He created you, Martin Scorsese. So don't make him as somebody who needs a couch and needs a Freudian psychologist to give him analysis.
I believe that it is the most serious misuse of film craft in the history of movie making.
It is without question the most blasphemous, the most disrespectful, the most satanic movie that's ever been filmed.
I wasn't aware of what a hot potato this was going to be.
It's filthy, indecent, and it will ruin Jewish-Christian relations for years to come.
I remember the studio wanted to give me bodyguards at the very beginning, because there were lots of, threats.
That was an organized movement to tell the faithful of their different denominations, Protestant denominations and the Catholic Church, not to see the picture.
This was the first stirring of the religious right, of people feeling that, they had ownership over this material, and that if, this was like, basically people feeling that, well, free speech is one thing, but if you're going to mess with the story of Jesus, you're going to be in big trouble.
It was about who controlled the culture. It was about cultural hegemony. Does, Hollywood control the image of our Lord, or do we?
The vitriolic condemnation of The Last Temptation was on a scale never seen before. In the 100-year battle between the church and film, this was the lowest point in their relationship ever. No one wanted to be associated with that kind of scandal, and the funding for religious movies completely dried up. The Christian right in America had effectively killed off the Bible movie, and there wouldn't be another one made in Hollywood for over a decade. This movement grew from strength to strength throughout the 1990s as a new era dawned in American history, an era that saw people take to fundamental Christianity like never before.
You see the face on the TV screen coming at you every Sunday.
Well, the Christian right is very strong in America, and there's no question about it. They've been working on this for 75 years or so. It's been a slow build up to this point.
'Cause Jesus, he knows me and he
In January 2001, these Americans finally found their Messiah when George W. Bush was sworn into the White House. At last, millions of God-fearing Christians had representation, in politics at least.
God bless! God bless you all. Thank you, and may God bless America. God bless! God bless you, and may God bless America.
But from mainstream Hollywood cinema, they were being shortchanged at the box office. These Christians weren't puritanical Luddites, they were modern, media-savvy Americans with disposable income that they were ready to spend if they could find something worth spending it on. In 2004, after 100 years of waiting, all their prayers were finally answered. When The Passion of the Christ was released in 2004, its graphic scenes of Jesus' suffering appealed directly to this new breed of right-wing Christian.
From a marketing point of view, the one thing that The Passion did that nobody had expected it to do was it targeted a ready-made audience that had basically been overlooked by Hollywood.
One commentator had a very good point. He said the secular critics don't understand why this movie is having such a powerful impact. See, they think people are going to the movies. But they're not going to the movies, they're going to church.
This is my church.
The film's success was no surprise to America's Christian population, as Bible films were about to enter a whole new phase. For at least a year before The Passion's release, Mel Gibson had specifically pitched his film to Christian groups by holding mass test screenings with them, many of which he personally attended.
We were part of the very first group to see the movie. The movie came out in February in the United States, as you might recall. We saw it in June of the previous year.
I was able to see The Passion of the Christ about 7 months before it was released, when I was invited to go to the offices of Icon Productions.
Mel Gibson sat right behind me, and when the film screening was over, one of his representatives got up and even asked us for some feedback.
Courting Christian groups like this meant that when the film was released, word had already spread throughout America that all good Christians should support this movie.
When the film was released, it was released at almost a super saturation level, and people came out to see it in droves. It was the #1 movie the weekend it opened, and has since crushed the box office record, not only for films of its kind, but for R-rated films in general. This film was a phenomenon.
Hollywood was making movies for kids, teenage kids, and it was almost like there was this whole other audience that had been abandoned. And Gibson made a film that would work for them, and he found them, and they found him. And then, of course, Hollywood went, oh, look, you know, there's more money to be had.
Hollywood's success rides on A, the product, and B, the marketing of the product. And one of the things the studios are doing now is they're bringing in outside groups who are Christian focus groups, essentially, telling them how to tailor existing films or make existing films appeal to the Christian demographic.
One of the most influential of these groups is Focus on the Family, who run a film review website for Christians.
It seems a little odd for a Christian ministry to be involved in media reviewing, but it's because of our strong belief in the family and how media affects the family that we're into that. We'll say drug and alcohol content, and if there is any, it'll be listed there. Sexual content, it'll be listed there. Theological content, spiritual content, violent content, summary conclusion, but we'll just list it, and then we'll let families make that choice. Focus on the Family has a mailing list of 2.6 million people, families, representing whatever that is, times 4 maybe per family, around 10 million people. You can't help when you speak to that many people on a regular basis for Hollywood to see us as a possible marketing extension arm.
The American movie industry is worth about $8 billion a year, but the last statistics I read on how much Americans donate to churches is 5 times that. That's a huge amount of money that, in Hollywood terms, is going in the wrong pocket.
Focus on the Family is one of hundreds of Christian focus groups that Hollywood now regularly relies on when marketing a new movie in an attempt to secure the Christian dollar. The biggest test of this marketing strategy since The Passion was Disney's blockbuster The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which when tested proved an instant hit due to its overt Christian allegory and has since made almost $500 million at the box office.
If there is a pressure to go and see something,
from religious groups in the US, it tends to generate a box office response, which is why this is happening with the Chronicles of Narnia now, why the Christian right are adopting films.
The fact that Hollywood now tests any family-friendly movie on Christian focus groups first before their release proves one key point. Hollywood needs Christian audiences. But there's one more important question that needs to be asked. Do Christian audiences still need Hollywood? For the last 100 years, liberal filmmakers have been locked in a battle with conservative religious groups over the right to portray the Bible on film. But the incredible success of The Passion of the Christ marks the beginning of a new phase in that battle. Evangelical Christians are now turning their backs on the traditional entertainment industry and mobilizing in order to reclaim the Bible for themselves. Now, this isn't just an American phenomenon, it's crossing the Atlantic and washing up on our shores as well.
The BBC has come under attack for planning to broadcast a programme this weekend apparently jam-packed with swear words. It is a film of the successful West End musical Jerry Springer the Opera.
Well, I guess whenever you're dealing with a remarkable and challenging work of art, you've got to weigh different considerations up, particularly something like Jerry Springer the Opera, which has the potential to cause offence.
This is my Jerry Springer moment.
In December 2004, the BBC championed the right of an artist to creatively interpret biblical figures when it announced it was going to broadcast the award-winning Jerry Springer the Opera. However, the depiction of religious characters taking part in a Jerry Springer show raised huge concerns for Christian groups.
Act 2 of the opera was deeply offensive in the way that Almighty God was portrayed as this fat lump coming down on a lift, the whole business of Mary fumbling with Jesus' genitals and all that. I just felt that that was totally unacceptable.
There's Jesus shown in a sequin nappy as being effeminate and having an alternative lifestyle. There's F words and C words used, which I think is totally wrong.
Dear God, sorry to disturb you, but I feel that I should be loud and clear.
Although the show had been hailed as a staggeringly original piece of art, Christian groups were having none of it. They took to the streets in their hundreds to march in protest at what they saw as a brazen disrespect of their faith.
What we did first of all, in the daytime, with a peaceful group of 100 pastors and church leaders, we went outside the BBC and we burnt our television licenses to show that we were appalled that the fact that our money was being used to propagate a program like that.
We hold Jesus Christ dear to us, He's our Lord and our Saviour, and all we're saying is we are not prepared to put our money for our licence fees to support such film.
People have the right to be offended. What they don't have is the right to tell other people that they can't be offended.
It was a genuinely striking, bold, important piece of theatre. And part of what we do on the channel, always have done, is from time to time bring, or try to bring, really remarkable pieces of creative work to a wider audience.
Jerry up! Jerry up! What do we want? Jerry up!
When the show was televised in January 2005, it received a staggering 60,000 complaints, making it the most controversial broadcast in British television history.
This age we're moving into is potentially more argumentative, it's more discursive, there'll be more opinions expressed, more things thrashed out. And that's a good thing, but the consequence will be that you will start seeing sometimes big campaigns and big figures like this.
Christians have proved both in the UK and in America that they can galvanise themselves into an organised army and fight the battle against the liberal film industry. But what does this mean for the future of the Bible on film?
People are so timid right now. I'm shocked by how timid we have become as a people. People are afraid to say things that might cause offense. Offense is very important. Offense makes people think, it makes people argue. And that's an important thing, and we're losing all of that.
Hollywood doesn't want to make controversial films, because you're not really ever sure that they're going to succeed. So I think really, I don't see the studios ramping up and doing a lot of biblical films. I think the biblical film is finished for a while. Obviously not forever. It's too powerful and important a story for forever. But for now, I think it's over.
Oh, brothers, let's go down, let's go down.
It seems then that religious groups in the film industry may be heading their separate ways, as there is still a huge audience out there looking for entertainment with the right message.
In England, the church is a small audience. In the United States, the church is, clearly up to 60% of the population, with 85% of the population saying that they're Christian. So that's a big audience.
Matthew 28 commands us as Christians, as followers of Christ, to go in and preach the good news. We can do that with our lips, and most of us do, but I think the more creative we get in being able to get this message out, the better. So I think we have only begun to tap into how film can get that message out.
It's the end of the world as we know it.
The message America's 100 million born-again Christians want to hear is not strictly found in the Bible, but based on the apocalyptic prophecies from the book of Revelation.
There's a very extraordinary number of Armageddonists out there that are pushing towards the end of days.
The book of Revelation is one of the most difficult books in the Bible to interpret. It uses what is called apocryphal language that is not to be taken literally. So it will describe storms and stars and the earth coming to an end and all this type of thing. And it's all symbolic language, so you have to read it very carefully. The filmmakers, I think, took it and figured, well, we can get some shocks, get some thrills out of this.
It's the end of the world as we know it.
A new breed of evangelical films have created their own theology, focusing on the end times where Satan reigns on earth before the second coming of Christ, and their popularity has rocketed in the last few years. In fact, one Christian film company is now asking the question, with this amount of success, do they still need Hollywood at all?
Place to go. I feel that God wants me here.
Instead of us going to Hollywood, we said, you know what, let's take Hollywood to church. We suddenly realized that there's a real hunger for these types of movies. But rather than compete with all the big budget movies in the cinemas where we don't have the marketing dollars to support it, we said we have the churches to support this. We have more screens, and good quality screens, good projection screens with good audio, because there's a lot of big churches that with a lot of congregation who can support this.
What Cloud 10 Productions has embarked on could change the face of religious cinema as we know it. They've already made 2 films of a book series called Left Behind. Although not well known in this country, they've sold over 20 million copies worldwide, as their theme is of the second coming of Christ to cleanse the modern world of its sins, have proved enormously popular with born-again Christians.
I was there when millions of people vanished off the face of the earth. And when one single man rose to power to rule the entire world.
In October 2005, Cloud 10 released the 3rd film in their series, not in cinemas, but on screens in 3,250 churches across America. That's more than all the major North American theater chain locations combined.
I think the idea of bypassing theaters altogether, is really part of the zeitgeist. Everyone's saying, well, we don't need theaters. People watch this stuff at home. We'll just get them at the church. They'll buy it there. They'll take it home. We'll make our money. Who needs the theaters? Who needs to go through reviewers and critics and newspapers and all those kind of, atheistic mainstream media? We'll give it right to the people who care about it.
It's hard to encourage people to come to church by a bake sale or a great sermon. But when you can say, you have a first-run movie starring an Oscar-winning actor based on a best-selling book series, and it's right here at your local church, it's a pretty easy sell. Come in, watch the movie, tell us what you think.
Christianity was a general thing. People went to church on Sundays. People knew those stories. They don't know them now, except for the Christian right.
I don't feel very comfortable with considering the use of film as Christian propaganda. because it's terribly exclusive. You know, we live in a very multicultural society, and for Christian right groups to be adopting films as their message is very exclusive.
So, are mainstream Hollywood and the church finally going their separate ways? In the fight for the Christian dollar, films like The Passion have proved that when the church and filmmakers work together, they're a powerful combination. But it would be catastrophic if in this day and age, the biggest, most influential stories ever told were claimed exclusively by one single group. Maybe it's time that Hollywood stood up and wrestled back possession of the greatest stories ever told. So where are the new Cecil B. DeMille's and Martin Scorsese's? It's now time to step up to the mark and save the future of the Bible on film.